Welcome back to my channel, everyone. Critiquing Christianity. Today is the 24th of August, 2023. And I have a very daunting task ahead of me with this video. Because what I'm going to attempt to do, I'm putting emphasis on that word, because I have no... I'm under no illusion that this is going to turn out the way I want it to. I'm sure I'll go back and listen and start critiquing my own articulation of it, wishing I had done it better or differently. But there will probably be a lot of pauses, because I'm going to have to think very deeply throughout this whole video in order to search for the right words and the right terms to make this as simple as I possibly can. And this is already a topic that to make it simple is almost impossible. But I can make it as simple as I can within the parameters, perhaps, that I've been given, or that we've been given. So I'm not going to make a long introduction here. I'm just going to dive right into this. What I'm going to be doing is integrating all of the major arguments I have made against the Trinity and seamlessly weave them in and out so that we see how they interact with one another depending on what aspect of the doctrine of the Trinity we are confronting. So depending on what aspect of the doctrine we're confronting, the error that I will be, that I perceive the other side to be making may be the opposite in some cases of the error I had perceived them to make the argument before. Because we're going to go through a whole series of these, and it's not that I'm contradicting myself. It's that depending on what aspect of the Trinity they are talking about, their articulation will result in one error or another, which may or may not be congruent with the error they made in the previous point. So it's not that I'm not aware that they may contradict each other. I'm saying that depending on what aspect of the Trinity we are picking apart, the errors are going to be different. Having gotten that out of the way, again, let's just dive in. I have 6 major arguments that I'm tying together, and a couple of these points will probably have, maybe more than a couple of these arguments will have sub-points to them as well. I don't know what is the best order in which to cover these points. One order or another may be more intuitive for someone than for someone else, in terms of being able to tie it all together into one coherent picture. But as I said, all I can do is my best. So, okay, here's the first point. My first contention, and again, we are picking on Orthodox Christianity because it's what I came out of last. Previous to that, I was a Protestant. I spent 15 years in the Orthodox Church. And B, because I feel that they have a more sophisticated approach to the Trinity than the Western Church. And so we might as well aim high and aim for the biggest target or the most powerful target. In spite of what orthodoxy claims, in terms of making the personhood of God, or the personalness, the personality of God, center stage, as opposed to the divine essence. And this is a major critique that they make of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly in terms of the Roman Church's argument about the filioque. So the Roman Church says that it wasn't just the Father that spirated the Holy Spirit, that caused the Holy Spirit. The Son also participated with the Father in causing the Holy Spirit. So that's what we call the filioque, which in Latin basically means and the Son, or and from the Son, which the Orthodox reject. Because Orthodoxy recognizes that what any two persons have, in other words, if multiple persons have something in common, it must be predicated of the nature of God to all three persons. So they say you can't argue that nature causes a person, because you're starting with the impersonal and proceeding to the personal. And they want to start with the personal, which is why they emphasize the Father alone being the cause, source, or origin of the other two persons. However, what I would say to that is the following. The Father is one of the Trinity of persons. The Father is only causing two of the persons. The divine nature, however, envelops the entire Trinity, to include the Father. So the nature is the ground of the Trinity, of the three persons, the three hypostases. Ultimately, the nature grounds all three of the persons. And so when you talk about when Christians, all Christians, this is universal across all traditions, all Christians have the natural intuition to speak of God in his singularity, in his oneness, or in his unity. Not unity, unity is the wrong word. In his oneness or in his singleness. They speak of him in terms of the nature, or at least we think when we talk about the one God, we're thinking in terms of the nature which is common to all of the persons. So nature is greater than the Father if we're speaking in terms of quantitatively. The nature embraces all three persons. When we speak of the causation, of hypostatic causation, we're talking only about the causation of two of the persons by one of the persons. Now, another issue I have And by the way, I'm actually thinking about breaking up this video because I would love for it to be just one seamless video, but this could take a while. Having said that, another thing that should be pointed out is, aside from the fact that the Orthodox will make statements such as person or hypostasis is a mode of nature or an instance of nature, that's as far as they go in defining a person. Now, I'm not comfortable with those phrases because of how they sound. I know that Orthodox aren't trying to argue this way, and it's not what they mean by it, but what it sounds like is that even though they affirm that nature and person are distinct, by saying that a person is merely a mode of the divine nature or an instance of the divine nature, it doesn't sound like you're talking about distinct things. It sounds as though you're saying a person is simply a manner in which the nature behaves or acts or moves or presents itself. It doesn't sound anymore like you're talking about something that is distinct from the nature itself. But that was just a side note I wanted to make at the outset, because we're going to be talking about that, I believe, as the video progresses. The other point I want to make before I move on about that is, aside from that statement that they make, that a person is a mode or instance of the divine nature, none of the three persons can ultimately, within a Trinitarian context, have any sort of meaning unto itself or unto himself. Each of the hypostases' existence or being is purely relative. It's relative to the existence of the other two hypostases. So there's really no such thing as an hypostasis unto itself. There's no such thing as a person. They wouldn't know how to define a person in the abstract. Which is very odd when you think about it, because we can't even imagine doing that with anything else. We wouldn't say that a rock, isn't a rock unless there are two other rocks nearby, or at least one other rock nearby, so we know that it's a rock. A rock has certain things about it that make it a rock. Which brings me to, by way of contrast, my view of God, my understanding. In my understanding, God is a single subject, and that subject is a person. I don't start by talking about a nature or an essence. In fact, for me, it's just the opposite. Flip it around. When I talk about God as a divine person, I think of the essence as something that is integral to the person. So before I go on with my position, let me just explaining my position. Let me say, here are the two errors I believe Orthodoxy makes with regard to ultimately seeing God as a nature. What I just said, that's the first error, seeing God essentially as a nature with persons, or a nature that has persons, or a nature, yeah, I guess that's the best way you can put it. So, when you put it that way, you almost have to think of the persons as derivative, in some sense, of the nature. The many proceed from the one, or have their reference, their ultimate reference in the nature or the essence. For me, what makes God a person are two things. Essence, which in my understanding is the essential identity. It is the self, what in Sanskrit we would call the Atman. That's the essence of the person. The other part of the person, or element of the person, is divine consciousness, which would be the form of God, or the infinite body of God. So you have to have the essence, which constitutes your identity. In other words, it's the core subject of. The essence is the core subject of the nature or being, which is consciousness, divine consciousness. Okay, so in my understanding, I don't use nature, the terms nature and essence, interchangeably. I actually distinguish them. The one corresponding to the body, the other corresponding to the core subjectivity of the nature, which is the self. So we must start. The reason Christians have to start with the nature is precisely because they propose that there are multiple persons in the Godhead. That's why they have to start with something impersonal, the nature, which ties the three persons together into one and gives you one God. I can have personalism, I can have a consistent personalism by recognizing that God is simply a person. And then I can bring the so-called impersonal aspect of God into under the control of the person by making it simply constitutive of the person, rather than something that the hypostases are plugged into. Therefore, we don't have to talk about the hypostatization of nature in that sense. For me, all of nature, which is made up of divine consciousness, is the person of God made manifest in his body. That was just the first point, by the way, and I'm already at like basically 20 minutes. So let's end this video now, and I will come back and try to do the rest. But I will divide them up into parts so that everyone knows they need to be listened to or watched together and in proper order.